Russian President Vladimir Putin is making his first foreign trip since his re-election. He is in Beijing. Russia and China affirming diplomatic ties and releasing a joint statement earlier this morning that China's state broadcaster published. China and Russia announced joint programs that they say will ensure the economic and energy security of both countries, promoting two-way investment and large-scale energy projects. The statement also announced a subcommittee on China-Russia Arctic waterway cooperation. So these scenes from the welcome ceremony for the Russian president as he begins that two-day visit with military bands and a gun salute. China has been under scrutiny and pressure for not condemning Russia's war in Ukraine and for its ongoing exports of components needed for Russia's war. Briar Stewart is in Estonia covering the story for us this morning. Briar, interested in your perspective, former Moscow correspondent, someone who follows the Russian events very closely. What are these two leaders hoping to achieve with Putin's visit to Beijing?
Yes, Heather. And, you mentioned that we heard from them in that joint statement. That joint statement was 7,000 words that was published just after we kind of heard from them at this joint, press conference that they had. It wasn't really a press conference. They both prepared speeches which they delivered. And I think really what this visit is, there's a couple things. I mean, on the one hand, it's symbolic for Putin to make this his first visit of his fifth presidential term. It shows just how important that China-Russia relationship is. Putin had said that relationship, in fact, is a stabilizing factor internationally. You had Xi Jinping talk about how Russia remains a good friend, a good neighbor and partner. But all of that, of course, is the talk going on the surface, and a lot of the discussion will be taking place behind closed doors, and even in many ways separate from the leaders themselves, because Putin is there with a very large delegation. Not only does he have his newly appointed defense minister with him, who is a former economist, but he has the governor of the central bank, he has oligarchs with him. There's dozens of people that are accompanying him on the trip, and really what political observers are saying is that a big part of all of this is that there will be discussions around just how China and Russia can continue their trade relationship and find workarounds when it comes to the sanctions. And you mentioned that China has been criticized for continuing to export dual-use goods. Now, these are things like semiconductors, microchips, which could be used for civilian products, but they could also be used to create military products that would be then on the battlefield in Ukraine. And so that is really the concern. The U.S. has really stepped up the pressure on China to stop this. You had Antony Blinken, the U.S. Secretary of State, in Beijing in April, along with the Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. And what they're telling China is that if China continues to do this, and if Chinese banks are processing the transactions, the U.S. will basically cut them out of the U.S. financial system, which is making Chinese banks very nervous. And so that's why you have these discussions that are likely taking place behind the scenes about how these two countries can come up with a workaround. I spoke with one political analyst, Alexander Gabuev. Here's some of my conversation with him.
China is not trying to drop Russia and push it under the bus. We know that the dual-use goods still find their ways into Russia. A lot of damage has already been done because Russia managed to do stockpiles of Chinese chips that it uses for production of weapons. And also, large part of the agenda for Putin's trip is to find the safe ways around sanctions that will enable stream of critical components for the Russian military machine coming to Russian shores.
Now, I should say that the U.S. has already sanctioned a number of Chinese companies, and China has hit back against that, saying it's actually hypocritical for the U.S. to criticize China when the U.S. has supplied tens of billions of dollars in help to Ukraine.
Briar, I was thinking of the conversation with Xi Jinping and Emmanuel Macron as we talked about the kind of influence that France was trying to exert on China to put pressure then down the line on Russia. We were talking about that just the other day. The war in Ukraine continues. What are we hearing in terms of whether China is, in fact, exerting any pressure on Russia as far as the war goes? It is day 813 and still no end in sight. If anything, the fighting is re-intensifying.
Well, I would say if there is any pressure being exerted, it's certainly not obvious, because you had Ukraine come up today a number of times. Both leaders talked about the need to maintain sovereignty of different nations, and how they didn't want to see the conflict escalate even more. China last year put out a 12-point peace plan that was kind of seen as more of a general wish list of things that could happen, but there was no mention of Russia having to withdraw its soldiers from Ukraine. The U.S. criticized China's plan. But China does have a special envoy who's not only meeting with Russia, but also with Ukraine as well, and other Western officials. And next month in Switzerland, it's holding a peace summit. Switzerland is at the request of Ukraine. And dozens of countries are invited, and Ukraine is trying very hard to get China on board to be there. But Russia isn't going to be there. It's not invited. And what China has said is that it doesn't really see the point in having a peace summit where Russia is not participating. So it's not quite clear whether China will participate, but dozens of other Western countries will, including Canada.
Briar, thank you very much for all of that analysis. Briar Stewart is in Estonia for CBC News this morning.